All right. Well, good evening, everyone. Great to see everyone here for a discussion about elections in the Western United States. My name is Bill Gates. I'm the director of the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory. Served for 8 years on the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors and thrilled to be here. In addition to serving as the director, I'm also a professor of practice at the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. So I'd say we're all in for a treat this evening. If you're here, you probably have some level of interest in elections. And, we run elections a little differently out west than folks do in the rest of the country. And some people, like to criticize or question the way that we do it. But I'd say we're pretty proud of the way we run elections. So we thought it would be a great opportunity this evening to bring elections officials from around the West to be part of a panel. Now, before I introduce the people that are going to be on this panel, I also want to recognize we have a few other elections officials who are with us today. We have the Pima County Recorder, Gabriella Casares Kelly. Yes, who's joined us. Thank you. Thank you for driving up from Pima County. We also have the Maricopa County Elections Director, Scott Jarrett. Scott, thank you for being here. Pinal County Recorder, Dana Lewis. Dana, thanks for being here. And last but not least, I think coming all the way from North Carolina, we have the head of elections from North Carolina, Karen Brinson Bell, who's joined us. So she's our one token Southeasterner. That's right. That's right. So thank you for being here. But we really have a wonderful panel this evening. And first of all, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator. Moderator this evening is someone who, within election circles, needs no introduction. But this is David Becker. David Becker, you may have seen David. He's on TV a lot. He's actually the CBS News election analyst. So he's the guy you see on election night sitting there with Major Garrett and others at the desk at CBS. He's been in elections for decades. He is an attorney, served in the Department of Justice Voting Rights section, and many years ago he started up the Center for Election Innovation and Research, and they do incredible work, not only helping us to run better elections in the United States, but also helping people understand what good elections are run in the U.S. And he's an incredible advocate, as well as the founder of the Election Officials Legal Defense Network, which unfortunately is something that we've needed in this country, and he's provided great assistance. So, David, thanks for joining us to moderate. Also, we'll start here on the end, then we'll swing around. We have and this is a bipartisan panel, so we're very excited about that, very proud. And we have our Idaho Secretary of State, Phil McGrain. And Phil, before he was elected Secretary of State, he actually has county elections experience, because for those of us who know elections, we know the real work gets done in the counties. And so he was actually the Ida County, I don't know what you guys call it, clerk? What is it? Clerk. Okay, good. It's different, depending upon the state. So he was an Ida County clerk before he was elected Secretary of State. We also have the Weber County clerk auditor clerk. Is that right? And Ricky Hatch. And Ricky is not only does a wonderful job in that role in Weber County, but he is really a nationally acclaimed expert. People look to him on so many issues, including AI and elections. And I'm going to brag on that for a second, because he's a member of our advisory committee we have at the Mechanics of Democracy Laboratory on AI and elections. Next, we have the New Mexico Secretary of State, Maggie Toulouse Oliver. Thank you for joining us, Maggie. And then there's some other guy up here too. No, of course, my former colleague, we worked together at Maricopa County when he was the Maricopa County Recorder, and now proud to call him our Secretary of State here in the state of Arizona, Adrian Fontes. So with that, I will turn it over to David to moderate our panel.
Thank you so much, Bill. And thank you also to Arizona State University and the Cronkite School, and to the relatively new Mechanics of Democracy Lab, which Bill heads up here at ASU and has been a great partner in helping election officials across the country, even its relatively short time that it's been around. So not only are we joined by these four really excellent election officials, two Democrats, two Republicans, all from the West. And by the way, we mentioned this a little bit. There are three secretaries of state up here, but all four of these individuals have county election experience. Every single one of them. They know what it is to not only pursue policies from the state level, but also to actually do the hard work at the local level, the nuts and bolts of serving voters and training poll workers and finding polling places and counting ballots. And it's something I respect so much, as well as some of the election officials here in the room.
Well, David, maybe just to emphasize, because so you have the four of us, but there's only one other Secretary of State, Pennsylvania, that has election experience at the ground level, right? It's usually their state legislators who step into these roles. So it is unique to have.
And incredibly valuable, even if you come from different parties, you'll find just knowing what it is to do that hard work that often doesn't get seen, but that voters expect to be done because you notice it if it doesn't get done well, is really important. So when we talk about the West, and I myself am also a Westerner from Colorado and California, Bill alluded to this. Westerners do elections a little different, but actually what that really means is when you look at election innovation in the United States, almost all of it has originated in the West. Not always from the same place in the West, not always from the same policy perspective, but things we take for granted, like online voter registration, that started right here in Arizona in 2002, if I'm not mistaken. Things like the expansion of mail voting, which voters in the West have loved and really makes it convenient and accessible, particularly for voters in rural areas. That started out here in the West. There's so many things that started out here in the West because election officials of both parties came up with an idea and implemented it really, really well, and it slowly expanded out east. And the impetus for this whole panel was to address a concern that I think a lot of us have heard, which is why does it take so long to count ballots? It's usually phrased exactly that way. And the first question I want to ask each of you is, how long does it actually take to count ballots? And is that too long? Because a lot of what drives the perception of ballot counting isn't actually the process that all of these folks and their county compatriots and others do. It's often driven by the perception of when the media can call a race, because that's what people view as important. So let me start. Phil, is it okay if I start with you? Just like how long does it take to count ballots?
We're on Adrian's home turf, so I don't know.
Well, we can start with Adrian. Let's start with Adrian.
Oh no, guests first.
Defer.
Please.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Don't be careful. I'm gonna.
Okay, I'll answer.
Yeah, there we go.
Take that long.
It doesn't take that long. I think there's a perception that it takes a long time. We have, and we were all talking about this, we had a meeting earlier today. You know, really, we have 95% of the ballots counted. Most of our states allow us to pre-process our mail ballots so that we're really running them through the tabulator and you know, even just pulling results on election night. The election day votes, the early votes are able to be processed on election day. What we're really waiting on at the end of the night is the residual ballots. So a ballot that's been dropped at a polling place, a ballot that's been dropped in a drop box or comes in at 7 p.m., or a provisional ballot. And that does take time because we want to make sure we're qualifying correctly and counting correctly. But I think people mistake the canvass process, right? What I call our first layer of election audit for being, you know, something that takes a long time and we don't have official results and blah, blah, blah. And I'll let my colleagues kind of speak more on that. But we need to have that, I think, important process of making sure that we're dotting the I's, crossing the T's, making sure everything adds up properly, because what you don't want is you don't want us to skip that step and then get things wrong.
Because even though the results are unofficial when you report them out in the days immediately after an election, incredible damage could be done by reporting them out wrong, right? So you know there's an urgency to get them out quickly, but there's a necessity to make sure some due diligence is done, even though the really in-depth due diligence might go on 2 or 3 weeks after. Right?
Yeah, and I think there's some level setting that we've got to establish here. First and foremost, there's like 3 things you can have in elections results, right? You can have them cheap, you can have them fast, you can have them accurate, but you only get 2 of the 3. Okay, and that's just a truism I think that we've all sort of grown into. And so that's one of the things that's really important. The other thing that's really important is this: network calls, the things that your friends over at CBS do, and they do all of their math.
That's
those
not my
are
day job,
not-
so
those are not results. And I think that's the one thing that we have the biggest problem with, is this notion that when a network makes a call, that's an election result. It's not. And I think our friends in the media could do a much better job in qualifying that. Not you, of course. I know you know the
well, and then
difference.
CBS did a better job, I think, this. as I've been advised.
I think so. But the distinction between what is an unofficial result and what is an official result, that to me is really what we're dealing with here. And then we've got, a portion of folks out there who are saying, well, it's embarrassing if we don't know. It's not embarrassing if we don't know. Let me give you the Arizona example. Um, some of your states are a little bit more, I should say, a little bit less competitive than Arizona, right? When John McCain was winning elections by 25% of the vote, 30% of the vote, we'd know on election night, networks would make the call and everybody would leave us alone because nobody cared who won the other elections. Now that we are much more competitive, the eyes of the nation are on us and they want the networks to be able to make the call earlier. Well, tough. And so I just think that I said this earlier today, the tail is wagging the dog a bit in this question. And I think we need to be more real.
I'm going to head over to Phil and Ricky in a second, but I think you raised a really big point, which is that all of your states, all of your counties have a process for finally counting all of the ballots. And the margins might be 40%, it might be 4 votes. I mean, it is, you're going to go through that process. The media is looking for inputs in order to count those, and the single biggest variable into how quickly they can call a race, in other words, they're comfortable enough that the rest of the ballots won't change it, is the margin of victory. And that's one thing none of you control at all. And I think, as we become a more closely divided nation, we haven't adapted to that reality that sometimes you're going to need to count those last few ballots to figure out, certainly here in Arizona with the Attorney General's race in 2022 and other races, the election officials need that time to get to the point where they can actually call it. Phil and then Ricky, what are you seeing in your states with that regard? To that regard, your states are not considered to be particularly competitive from a national perspective on a statewide basis, but I'm sure you have local races, county races that do get very competitive, perhaps in primaries. How does this play out in your states?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. So one, our races are very competitive in the primary, right? That's where all the attention goes. That's where all the shift is. We're a very, very red state, overwhelmingly. I think right now, 59% of Idahoans are registered as Republicans. So that just gives you a sense of where our starting point is. But I think there's a lot of policy decisions. So one, I will say Idaho finishes getting its results in faster than, say, my peers here. But part of that is because the way we run our elections is different and the way that people vote is inherently different. So majority of Idahoans choose to vote on election day. We still have polling places, the traditional approach. So about 70% of voters will show up to a polling place in their local area. We have about 15% that vote by absentee. We have another 15% that vote in person early. That's an entirely different mix from states where you have access. Like you can't get on a list to get an absentee ballot automatically mailed to you in the state of Idaho. Each year you have to go in and request it. That's something different than, say, how it is here or in Utah, where they've implemented the ability to mail them out. I do think I want to touch on, David, one of the things you mentioned is just how, one, these policy decisions make a big difference. So when you start looking closely at each of the 50 states, you really start to tease out differences. And I think one of the biggest challenges I often see is, I always call myself an elections junkie. There's these narratives of red versus blue states. And when you look at it, the map actually doesn't work out that way. Most Western states have much greater access to voting than Eastern states. There are a lot of blue Eastern states in the New England area that have very restrictive voting policies. They are very outdated. And yet here out West, largely because of our geography, right? We have people, there's a lot of people here in Maricopa County, but there's a ton of people and a lot of geography to travel across the entire state of Arizona. Similarly, it's like 9-hour drive from the bottom to the top of Idaho. And you've got people scattered all over the place. And that really plays into it. So how you structure these elections makes a difference. And I think that attention to detail matters that you were touching on. We had a very competitive legislative race during our primary last year. And on election night, and I think this is where it goes into it, it was determined by 10 votes. And you can imagine that's pretty darn close in terms of a legislative race. And you have people wondering, but like, we've had lots of recounts. I've been through a bunch of recounts. I remember even talking to our attorney general. He's like, you'll never be able to find 10 votes. That's just not going to happen. Well, as we're doing the canvass that you heard them mention, we actually determined that there had been a fat finger error by one of the counties. It went from 10 votes to 2 votes, all because of which digit. And I'm thankful that the clerk made an error in the ones digit, not the tens digit or the hundreds digit. But
That
still,
guy was right. They couldn't find 10 votes.
they couldn't find
There
10
was
votes.
no way. 8 votes maybe.
But no,
not
but
10.
that's the problem. But the problem is you can appreciate this as we headed into the recount. Initially, people are like, I don't even know if it's worth it. We're not going to find 10 votes. But when all of a sudden we went from 10 to 2, people are like, oh, well, we just gained 8. We can easily get those last 2 yards. All right. And so, like, everyone's honed in. Now, I'm happy to report we did a very thorough recount and went through all ballots. Both parties got to see it. The results stood at those 2 votes, which is how the system really should work. But you can imagine just the test of the system that is. And I think what's important in this case, it was 2 counties that were involved, a larger and a smaller county. The county where the error was made was the small county that hand counts ballots. We still have a number of counties that do hand counting because of we have 2 counties that have under less than 350 registered voters. And this is where these policies really play out and make a difference.
This is such a great point. I mean, one of the things I often talk to folks about, when you hear a 10,000 vote margin in a statewide race in Arizona, that seems like it's really close when you look at the percentages. But what most of us who are lawyers and have worked in the election space will tell you, a 10,000 vote margin in a statewide race is, from our perspective, a landslide. I mean, there has never been, to my knowledge, and I've looked at this, a statewide race anywhere in the United States decided by 1,000 votes or more that has ever been overturned by any kind of recount, or that it's, the percentage might be very, very small. 2 votes is legit, by the way. 537 votes in Florida might be legit. That's at the upper edge. But once you get to the 10,000 plus vote margin, there's just no error. And Ricky, your state of Utah, despite being, from a statewide perspective, not particularly competitive, still has been a center of some kind of disinformation fueled by how long it takes to count votes. And Utah is a very heavily vote by mail state. Could you talk a little bit about what you're seeing in Utah?
Yeah, you bet. So in Utah, on average, about 96 to 98% of voters return their ballot by mail or drop box. So we mail ballots to every active registered voter. So it's a huge by mail turnout, a very small in-person turnout. In November of 24, that in-person turnout tripled to almost 9%. Utah definitely is a very high vote by mail state. On election night, when we released our results as a state, the results accounted for about 65% of the total votes that were cast. And you might say, wow, that's really low. What about that remaining 35%? Well, in Utah, as in most of the places across the country, voters like to wait until the last minute to cast their ballot. And so a lot of these voters waited until election day, went to their drop box on election day, sometimes at 7 p.m., 7:30 p.m., right before polls close, and they drop it. Well, our election officials at the county level have been working for 3 weeks, 10 to 18-hour days. And I'm not going to force my team to, on election night, when they got into the office at 4:30 a.m., to stay until 2:30 a.m. to make sure all those votes are counted. That's how mistakes happen. And there are a couple things you don't want to rush: brain surgery and elections. You don't want to have to rush that. It's so important. So we close things down fairly reasonably because we're coming back the next morning at 6 o'clock for another 18-hour day. And that 65% on election night, that's a really good statistical sample because it's from all over the county. It's not necessarily one precinct that leans red or blue. It's a great statistical sample. And so I tell candidates who call me in a panic, are things going to change? And they rarely do. You're going to have a little bit, especially because more recently a lot of the Republicans have emphasized voting on election day. And so there is a little bit of a red surge on election day. One unique thing that happened last November in Utah that got us national attention is the state and none of the counties and the state did not release any election results till about 10:30 p.m. You talk about pressure on the county clerks and on the lieutenant governor. In Utah, the lieutenant governor is in charge of the overseeing elections. We didn't have any results. The funny thing is CNN called our U.S. Senate race at 8:01 p.m.
Yep.
even though they had zero results from any counties. But we didn't release the results, not because we hadn't counted them. At 8:15 p.m., every county was ready to go with their 2/3 of ballots cast. The problem was we had lines at our counties, and voters were still in line voting. And the lieutenant governor made a good decision, I think, and a very difficult decision. Do we postpone the releasing of the first round of unofficial results? Or do we release those and know that there will be voters who are still waiting to cast their ballot or who are in the process of voting who will now see the results and say, oh, my candidate won or my candidate lost, my vote doesn't count. And they're just going to leave. They'll self-disenfranchise because we released results beforehand. But that caught the ire of our legislators because they want to know, we want to know who won. And like we talked about, nobody wins on election night. The famous photograph of President Truman holding up the newspaper headline that says Dewey defeats Truman. And in fact, Truman actually won. That's really legitimate.
And I think, Adrian, you had some to add there. I just want to say really quickly what Utah Lieutenant Governor did in 2024 is not that unusual. In 2022, the Nevada Secretary of State did the same thing when there were polls open late because there was a snowstorm in northwest Nevada. And, you know, it's an election official's nightmare to have done something even inadvertently that might affect a voter's decision on whether or not to cast a ballot. So you always err on the side of making sure voters feel as if their ballot's going to matter no matter what, right? Did you follow up on that, Ricky?
The follow-up I'll say is by the Friday after Election Day, so 2 or 3 days later, we were at 97% of all ballots cast had been counted. So just a couple of days later, and we're virtually at 100%. The only remaining ones are provisionals, or people who voted on Election Day and there's some kind of issue about their legitimacy to actually cast their ballot, their qualifications. And that takes a lot of research. And you'll find this in almost every state. It just takes time. Sometimes it takes up to 10 minutes per voter. So it takes time. You want to do it right. Don't rush it. And just be patient. You get the results when the results come. In Utah, that's 2 weeks after Election Day. It's been that way for decades. And it's the right thing to do is to take your time and verify.
Adrian?
One of the things I think that's really important in this discussion, and we all know this very well, is that changing or implementing a policy over on this side might have to the untrained eye, or might not have to the untrained eye, impact. We will see where these other impacts are. And I wanted to touch on something that you mentioned about voting. Voters would like to vote at the last minute. They like to turn in their ballots at the last day. This is something that is just like, I know in Arizona, we're just like, oh, we want them to turn it in early. But here's one of the other circumstances I think that complicates things. Maricopa County's ballot in 2024, as I recall, had 85 different elections on it. It was 2 pages long, both sides. There were 13 initiatives. There's, I don't know, a few dozen judges. And so the notion that we're going to, like, just because we want results quicker, we're going to force everyone to vote on election day. The idea that people are going to stand in, like, where are we going to find the space to have these massive vote centers? And I'm giving Scott nightmares just the thought of if we went to just election day, right? Or if we cut off ballot by mail voting or turning in your ballot on the Friday before, which was a proposal here in Arizona, the clog of people, just the humanity that we'd have, the crush on those size of ballots. It's one of those unintended consequences that could go really, really wrong. So when we have these conversations, regardless of what it's about, whether or not we should have judges, whether or not we should have an election every year, whether or not we should, stop mail-in at this time or that time. You've got to have folks in the conversation that understand the downstream impact of every single one of these decisions, because you could have massive implications that are just really bad, unforeseen circumstances. I mean, Bill was talking about this earlier in one of the things we did. So I think that's a really important part of the conversation.
Bill?
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on that. I definitely want to echo Secretary Fonta's comments about the unintended consequences. And we have really good intentions in all of these policies. No matter who's behind them, what side, doesn't matter. Election consolidation. So this is putting more races on a same ballot so that voters can show up on the same day to make these decisions is a pretty widely spread and push for. Because as a member of the voting public, it makes perfect sense. Why should I have to show up multiple times? These off elections, people don't attend. But there are other elements to it. One, I would say, especially out west, we have a knee-jerk reaction towards direct democracy, which is where we vote on everything, hence why however many races you just referred to. And again, I'll give another story. So the 2020 election obviously got a lot of attention, particularly here. But I lived through a very contentious recount in the 2020 election in the Boise area. And it wasn't the president. It wasn't anything interesting. It was a highway district race. And this is different than the last race I referred to. But again, it was determined by 2 votes. And what was crazy about this race was, so it's 2 votes apart for this highway district. It was 2 votes out of over 40,000 votes cast. So that's less than 0.005% difference. If it was a vaccine, we would easily approve it at that rate. And we went through, and it was contentious as all get out. The sheriff's office actually had to separate the 2 parties in observation because it had gotten so heated in the midst of it. And what was wild as we went through the recount, I have lots of stories that come out of this, but one of the most fascinating things is you could talk to anybody who's ever run for office. They can always find 2 people who didn't show up to vote. Right? Neighbors, family, coworkers, it doesn't matter. You can find 2 people really easily. And it's painful to come that close. But what was most shocking out of the recount about this is over 40,000 people had cast a ballot that day. That means they had a ballot, they had a pen. Of those 40,000 people, 10,000 of them skipped that race. They didn't vote for anybody. So it wasn't a matter of encouraging anyone to show up or to participate, is they had no idea who these people were. And so they just didn't vote. And so while it's well-intended, these policies, and I think that's what you were going to, Adrian, instead you have these outcomes that like this wasn't what was intended. And here we are really testing the system, let alone like how many people voted just because a name felt familiar, not because that was actually their, they were an informed voter, as we're all, like to think about.
I'm going to go to you, Maggie, on this next, because something that's been raised here is the complexity of our ballots, the number of races that are on our ballots. I'm sure many people here, and you all have heard this, why can't we count ballots as fast as France? Well, that's because France has 1 race on their ballot nationwide, and it's the same ballot, whereas Maricopa County has 85 races. Most other, particularly Western states, as we've kind of alluded, very common, dozens and dozens of races. Looks a lot different than what other people are voting on. I'm sure if you had a ballot that actually had just 1 race on it, how fast could you guys get everything counted? Be very, very quick. And that leads to things like what election researchers will call roll-off, which is where you see fewer people voting down ballot. Now, 2020, we actually had a weird roll-up issue where Arizona documented it. Georgia did a very good job where there were people who voted Republican all the way on the ballot but left President blank. And that often exceeded the margin of victory in the presidential race, and reflected that voters were very, have complex feelings about who they're going to vote for and how they're going to reflect their choices. I want to get into this issue of the complexity of our ballots and how that really makes it so that we can't and we shouldn't just flip a switch and think we get all of the results right away on, at 7:01 or 8:01 p.m. whenever polls close. Maggie, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, before I was an election official, and I've been an election official for I'm in my 19th year now. I worked on campaigns and I was an advocate and I did all that stuff. And so I'm from like the old school when the left was skeptical about, voting machines and elections. And I mean, I remember working as a volunteer at our county's voting machine warehouse one night and like literally I was like counting the number of ballots that were given to me and then I was handing them over and I swear the election director, and again, this was before I was a county clerk, he was just being like, oh my God, this woman, like, just give it, but, there was skepticism. And of course, since I've been an election official, I mean, and I think we'll all tell you, I mean, machines count way better than humans. Way, 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 way better. And, nothing's ever perfect. And that's why you always have to have a human element, a human element.
Elephants are welcome.
Human element and make sure that we have both high tech and low tech approaches to running elections just to make sure, right, that everything is done properly and done right. You can't just trust one side of that process or the other side. You need to have a good mix. But yes, ballots have become so much more complicated, and it was so funny that you mentioned that, David, about France. I have a colleague who I will not mention who was like, well, France can do it in one night. And like, here I'm sitting, not this particular group of people, but with, a similar group of people, Democrats and Republicans. And we all turned around and looked and thought, what are you talking about? We have 80 questions, 40 questions, what have you. So we do rely on this technology. I think, yes, our ballots are complicated, but I think are complex. I think what's really important to remember is that voters are complex. Voters are not going to behave the same way in every single election. Sometimes voters are going to leave president off at the top because they don't like either one. Sometimes they're only going to come in and vote for president and leave everything else out. I don't know what happened to my mic.
It's not, in Arizona, there might be like a Trump Gallego voter, right?
Right.
I mean, that we know those people exist.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes voters are going to, a lot of voters do not vote a straight party, right? They'll vote maybe up ballot differently, down ballot differently. So I think that's the piece, I think, that where we start seeing this, well, the algorithm predicted this outcome, or because of past voting behavior, we saw this, it's going to look this way. All the voters are going to come out for early voting or on election day. We just don't know. We don't know what the voters are going to do from election to election. So I think that's a really important thing, and we have to plan for any or all of it.
So let me, and if anyone has any questions, I think we're going to try to get to a few questions, so be thinking of them. We've got a microphone here. One of the things I'd like to move to, because we've talked about how hard it is to count ballots as fast as people might expect and how the perception might be different than the reality. I mean, I know here in Arizona and Maricopa, we're actually counting ballots as fast as ever. In many of your states doing the same. The margins are just narrower. So with all that said, are there some people, look, we all want to know who won on election night right away, right? That's a normal human thing. It's not wrong to want to know right away, even if expectations might be a little unrealistic. What can we do to try to feed that realistic demand, to try to get results out? Are there things we can improve a little bit to try to get more ballots cast accurately, efficiently, quickly, without reducing access to the polling place, without unnecessarily increasing costs, without running the risk of reporting inaccurate results? Anyone? Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations I get to participate in, and oddly, the states that I'm with, despite the criticism, are doing this, is just the pre-processing of absentee ballots. So there's an important narrative I always like to highlight. So the 2020 election, so Idaho currently doesn't have that, but our legislature did pass it for just the 2020 election. And it's really interesting because leading up to 2020, we had a special legislative session, authorized a couple of changes. One of them was the pre-processing of absentee ballots. And what that means is just the ability, don't know results, but to scan the images and to run them through the machines. Because if you can imagine, it just takes work and it takes time.
And to verify the identity of the person who returned
for the machine to scan the ballot. That's a physical thing that it just takes time to do. And I will say it's really beneficial to do it in advance when you can be more methodical. If anything happens, you can slow down. Whereas when you get past election day, the pressure's on, right? Like the clock is now ticking, people are watching. What was fascinating is our legislature took it up for that election and we allowed it. And Idaho ended up in 2020 being the second state to have its results completed that cycle. The Pennsylvania legislature took up almost the exact same policy decision at the same time Idaho was debating it, except for Idaho passed it, Pennsylvania did not. We are all very familiar with the narrative of how long it took in Pennsylvania to go through that. And it really boiled down to this. And it didn't just feed the narrative of time, which is what we talk about. But I think this is really important because one of the things that was fascinating about the 2020 election was the self-sorting that voters did. If you go back in time, and we have to remember pre-election day during that cycle, leading into that, COVID was still present and a thing, and there was fear around it. And so you had President Biden saying the safest way to vote is to vote by mail. You need to vote by mail. You had President Trump saying, no, you need to vote in person. And actually, we see it in the data, especially because we're an in-person voting state, that voters self-sorted. 60+% of our votes and by absentee were Democratic votes. On election day, it was over 71% were Republican votes. And so when we're releasing results, as Ricky kind of alluded to earlier, we release them in batches by how we scan them. So for us, the first votes we released were our absentee votes because we had scanned them and processed them before. So if you were to watch Idaho's results, they started out towards President Biden and they shifted towards President Trump. If you looked at Pennsylvania, they released election day results first. So it started out towards President Trump and shifted towards President Biden. And it's really an order of operations, not actually trends in voting. It just happens to be how the official is releasing the results based on the policy decisions has a big impact. But you can see, we all now have seen how that impacts people's perceptions of the election and confidence just based on some mechanical behavior that had nothing to do with the actual outcomes themselves.
Yeah, so I was asked to do an analogy for this before the election, and I said if you've got a fishbowl with red and blue jelly beans in it, 1,000 jelly beans, and it's 900 red jelly beans and 100 blue jelly beans, and you don't know whether there's more red or blue, you probably don't have to count the whole fishbowl to know that there are more red than blue. But if it's 501 and 499, you got to get down to the very last jelly bean in there to know exactly who won. And so similarly, you might take a handful out, and that might be the early reported ballots, right? And they might be mostly red, but you're going to have to go back down and see what's down at the bottom of that bowl and by the way, this is intuitive. Everyone knows this is true. It's usually candidates that think they're losing that are casting doubt about that, before the count is finished. If you think you're winning, you're going to trust the process. If you think you're losing, you might be incentivized to distrust it. Anyone else on this topic?
I think so.
Ricky or Adrian?
Yeah, just real quick. So one of the things, Maricopa County has taken from 10 to 14 days to process their ballots and finish their official count forever.
Mm-hmm.
And Maricopa County is one of the fastest growing places in the United States of America. So we get tons and tons and tons of more people, but we count our ballots faster. So that's one of the things I think that's really important. Like I don't think we're very successfully telling that story, if that's even a story that, because when you're explaining, you're losing, and that's problematic. But one of the ways, to your question, that we can kind of, I think, get to a better place on this is figure out a way to get our elected leaders to understand the process better themselves. People listen to elected officials. People listen to their legislators. They listen to their boards of supervisors. They listen to their mayors and their council people. And what drives me bonkers is hearing these folks who are out there saying the wrong thing. Like they're just peddling falsehoods as against a system that put them there. And
Right.
that
Do you think
that to me is crazy.
But do you think that's because of a lack of understanding, or do you think that's bad faith?
I would like to believe that it's a lack of understanding because I think that there's good in everyone. But I also am not an idiot. And I think some of them are just, for whatever their motivations are, want chaos. They want people to distrust the systems. I don't know why somebody would want that, particularly when they are the system.
I was just going to add, and I'm sorry, I know Ricky hasn't commented yet, but just on this exact topic that, and I think, Phil, you actually alluded to it. Well, you didn't allude to it. You made this point. As election officials in the moment, when we're trying to get results out and we're trying to get our process, and we're not thinking about, well, what are the political implications of if we release this batch versus this batch, right? We're just doing our job and we're like, we know people want their results. So we're like, okay, I have all my early vote in the can. I'm gonna push that at 7:01 p.m. I have all of my absentee in the can, except for whatever came in, during election day. I'm gonna push that. We're not, and that's the thing. But then it's to everybody else's point. It's the people who are looking for some sort of political advantage in interpreting results that come earlier versus later, that it's getting manipulated. And I can tell you, as election officials, it doesn't matter red, blue, everything in between, nothing makes us more frustrated than that, because we're just here like trying to get our results out and do our job, right? It's so frustrating.
It might be a fundraising advantage they're also looking for.
Right.
Phil, I'm going to go to you, but if anyone has any questions, I'm going to ask you to step up to the microphone, because otherwise we're going to keep yapping. So Phil, I'll go to you.
Well, one of the tough tensions that we live in is, you can appreciate, we're all junkies and in the weeds of it. So we want to show and explain our work. And I think to Scott's credit in particular, if someone was actually to look at what 2 million ballots look like stacked on pallets, it's overwhelming. And then if you say, not only do you need to count each of those sheets of paper, and there might be 2 sheets of paper for all 2 million of them, you also need to count all of the little ovals or boxes on every one. I mean, it's a small miracle what we accomplish in that time frame. And what you're hearing from us too, and we can all relate to this, is like, you've done something at home, whether it's for your parents or a spouse, and you just wish they knew how hard you worked on it, right? Is like, this is really tough, because I think, like, personally, philosophically, I would think the best form of government is the government that goes unnoticed, right? You don't think about how the road got there. You just appreciate that the Uber got you here. And elections are the same way. We want it to actually work, where you vote, you cast your ballot. You don't think about where it went after it went in the box. You watch the news, and there's David who tells you who won, right? And
hopefully I'm not the one telling you who won. If I am,
it's-
then you're
it's-
watching the wrong channel.
Yeah, but it's so tough because we want both. I think, to Adrian's point, it's so tough because we want it to just go well, where there is confidence in the process so that people can go about their lives, right? And that we have leaders that reflect their communities. But at the same time, when it is scrutinized, there is this sense of like, no, we're working hard. Please see how complicated this system is all behind the scenes.
I talk about this all the time. Some of you have heard this before. All these people, and many of you in this room, were working in the 2020 election. Somehow, election officials, wherever you live, managed the highest turnout in American history, with waves of disinformation in the middle of a global pandemic, where 1,000 Americans were dying a day and your staffs were getting sick. Somehow managed all of that. And that election, that outcome, withstood more scrutiny than any election, not in American history, in world history.
Yep.
And the reward for all of the election officials that did that was vitriol and it's still going on for a long time. We should have thrown you and the hundreds of thousands of people across the country who do this, including poll workers, we should have thrown them an effing parade. And it's to your point, Phil, and I get it. Like, did you notice all this good work that I just did? And they're like, hey, it's 8:02. Where's the damn results, right? Yeah, Ricky, do you have anything else? And then we'll go to the first question.
I think the only thing that a couple of things. One thing that we're toying with in Utah, and we'll work with the legislature, is to pre-certify by mail envelopes that come in. So a voter may be able to, and some of my counterparts aren't super excited about this, but I love the concept of I drop my ballot in the drop box, then I go to vote.utah.gov, I enter some personal information, and then I click, yes, I've put my ballot in the drop box. When that comes to me as a county clerk, I then don't have to validate that signature, because that voter proactively came in and verified it. I can look at the signature later, but then that saves me the signature verification process. That might speed things up. And then the last thing I'll say, the number one, and surveys and studies have shown this, the number one predictor in a voter's confidence in the results of an election is, did their candidate win?
Mm-hmm.
And that's been proven over and over again. If your candidate won, you're far more confident in the results and the accuracy and the integrity of the election. The second most important factor is how quickly were the results released, which is unfortunate, because it almost should be the opposite. If we're really taking our time, especially in a close race, that's when you double down and you are extra certain. And we always run elections assuming it's going to be a tie. So we've got a couple things going against us as far as confidence.
Yeah, let's go to the first question.
Good evening. My name is Riley Mangandayo. I'm a public service and public policy student here at ASU. And my question was a little bit about what you were just talking about, but what role does disinformation play in the public perception of elections? And what resources would you say voters should look to get credible and real-time information about elections?
Great question. Anyone want to start? And let's try to keep answers a little short so we can get through them all. And
Maybe
end by 7.
I think that's a massive question, and I think the answer is it plays a massive role in the perception of elections. I think where we've come from as election officials, the bottom line is whatever you see, whatever you read, whether it be in the newspaper or social media or on CNN or whatever, just always double check with your local or state election officials. That's the bottom line. That is the trusted source of information, period, end of story. We could have a whole other one of these talking about your question though, because that is definitely something we've been dealing with, especially over the last 4 years and some change.
And I just want to say one of the things we've talked about, for all the talk about counting ballots faster and how it's the second most important factor, imagine what would have happened in Arizona in 2024 if all the ballots had been counted by 10 p.m. at night and Harris had won by 10,000 votes in 2024. And imagine what the supporters of the losing candidate might have said about how fast ballots were counted. And we've seen this before, right? That a lot of these are kind of ex post facto rationalizations for the first thing Ricky mentioned, which was we don't like the results, so we're going to go back and try to find something we have a problem with. Anyone else on this topic?
I just want to add, I mean, it is, I agree with Maggie, it's a much bigger conversation. And we have this tension in our country, and we will continue to, especially with the advent of AI. So what Bill was talking about is the First Amendment, free speech, our country. You know, we have, our founding fathers fought hard to talk bad about King George. And we all still feel that today. As public officials, there is a higher standard, like you're more allowed to talk bad about us than everybody in the audience, going back to what our founding fathers intended. And we see that also be exploited and abused, right? And things, whether it's Photoshop or other things, the world's getting harder to know what is real and what's not real. And so I think being able to identify sources, all of us have, you know, for elections, we have websites dedicated to informing the public and voters. And I think that's a big part in this. And I think this is something we're going to continue as a country to wrestle with moving well into the future.
Thank you for your question. Next.
Thank you.
Yeah, next question.
I think mine's a fairly brief one, maybe not, but you said that 90%, 98% of your ballots were mail-in ballots.
Correct.
Is that correct? And if I'm not mistaken, what, 70% of Arizona's? Am I close there?
We're into the mid 80s at this stage.
Okay. All right. I'm behind the times. I'm wondering, I'm wondering what you all do to validate the signatures. And I was kind of interested in your pre-certification process. If there are any other things in mind, how long does it take to validate? What are some other proposals for speeding it along? Thank you.
Anyone?
I'm going to sit down.
Yeah, the controls surrounding validating whether an envelope has been returned is with a correct election, it's with a correct voter, they're allowed to vote in that election, they haven't already tried to vote. Those controls are very detailed and very robust. They may differ a little bit between Idaho and New Mexico and Arizona and Utah, but generally the concept is pretty close to the same, and it almost always involves some form of signature verification. It depends on the size of the jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions use technology. And my thought is technology is fantastic. Its eyes don't get tired, but you audit it like crazy. So trust technology, but audit it like crazy. And then you can feel a lot better about that.
Every state does identity verification of the mail ballots. Some state does an initial pass with software. Some states, Oregon does it every single one by hand, even though every single ballot is by mail. but they're all validated. And one point I think is also important because of the way voter registration databases are maintained now and have been for the last 2 decades or so. If there were some kind of mail ballot fraud going on, in other words, people taking someone else's ballot, returning it, we would see that at any kind of scale, because some people would try to vote and they would have been marked as already voting, or having not received a mail ballot, or having received a mail ballot. So there's all kinds of checks in the system that would have flagged any kind of mail ballot fraud on scale that could change the outcome. Phil,
Well, and I think a couple just, information pieces. I do think generally speaking, it's pretty much the same. There may be a question of technology, but I think we're all doing similar processes. Is one, we train people for signature verification. What is a loop? What is a slant? There's all people who do this now. And I will say, like, all of us will say, like, well, my signature varies. And as someone who's personally reviewed lots of signatures, it doesn't vary that much, right? If you look at your signature, it's actually pretty similar. And actually, one of the things that we've had to contend with as an industry is the digital signature pads, like your credit card thing. People are like, well, I don't sign that at all the same. And I'm like, yeah, but every time you go and you use your debit card or whatever, you'd be surprised how consistent your sloppy signature is. Like, you still do the same motion every time, and that's kind of lost in this process. And so we do provide the training. And I think the final point is, all of us do end up rejecting ballots. Now, we try to get in contact with voters, and sometimes these turn into voter fraud cases that get pursued. But it's not, we talk about validation because we do overwhelmingly validate them, but it's also just important to know that we do reject signatures. It could be that it's the spouses, it wasn't the right person who signed it. It could be, all sorts of different things. And I think that's important to know in this process too.
And so we've got a hard stop in 4 minutes.
Just 20
Yeah.
seconds. In 2016, there was a candidate for Maricopa County Recorder who thought we should go to all precincts, all voting in person, no more mail-in balloting. And then he got elected to be Maricopa County Recorder, learned about the system, and is now one of its greatest cheerleaders because of the checks and the balances and the confidence looking at it from the inside. Reasonable minds can differ if you don't have the right kind of information, but once you have that same information and you're dealing from the same facts, the systems are really, really good.
So much personal and professional growth on your part. It's
I'm a lifelong learner.
last question.
Hello, my name is Kyler. I'm a Master's of Public Policy student here at ASU, and I am just curious how election skepticism has impacted the election administration, mostly in rural counties. I guess, compared to 2024 and post-election, how has that changed?
I have a former colleague who left because 2 of her dogs were poisoned. I have officials right here in Arizona who have left recently because of the lack of support in their communities. I have colleagues and friends who have been personally impacted in some pretty severe ways. I myself have had threats, people showing up at my house, all kinds of stuff like that. It impacts us at a human level, and it impacts us at a human level in for the absolute wrong reasons. And that impacts the way we do our work, and it impacts the fact that we've lost so many in this profession in recent years because of that sort of stuff. But the good thing is we've got projects that are happening both here at Arizona State. There's a class that I sat in on at NAU. We've got a lot of young people who are coming to this. We started a fellowship program this last year where we placed, I think, almost 24 college students or recent college grads in county election officers around the state so they could learn what it was like from July to the end of November. So there's a new crop coming up who know all of this stuff, and they want to come in anyway. And that illustrates very clearly to me the value that this still has. So impact, huge, but there is hope.
Maggie, I'm going to go to you next because Maggie's got to get back to New Mexico for important work that she's doing there. So if you do you have any last thoughts, and then and then you can drop your mic and.
Thank you. And yeah, I apologize that I'm not going to be able to meet and greet. I do have to catch a flight. But no, I mean, I think we all have stories. And I know my friend here got choked up because, I mean, I think that's been the hardest part is this work is already really hard. And around election time, we already work 80, 100-hour weeks. You know, we kill ourselves to get things right. And I'm looking at my colleagues over here too. I mean, we all know, and we do this work because we believe in it, and because, you know, elections are the foundation of our democracy, and we feel blessed to be in public service and to do this work. But, you know, when your personal life or your family or your friends are having to suffer, and we're talking real suffering, it just makes it really hard. And unfortunately, I think that's intentional. Yeah.
Any last thoughts?
Uh, Same thing in Utah. 3/4 of our county clerks today were not county clerks in 2020. So there's been a huge turnover. My car was vandalized 3 different times on key election dates. The challenge, I think one of the biggest challenges is everything we do with transparency to make sure that the voters are sure. And we go triple overboard because, in much part, because of the misinformation and the skepticism that's created by that. And that bogs down the reporting of results. It slows us down the number of reconciliations that must be published in a certain way. So if we want results faster, I'm not saying don't do these reconciliations, but that heavy skepticism does slow result reporting.
And I'll just add briefly, and then Bill will say some final words. I mean, we run the Election Official Legal Defense Network, EOLDN.org. We've seen the toll that it's taken on election officials, and lest anyone thinks it is not relegated to Democratic election officials. It is not relegated to Republican election officials. Yep. It is not relegated to swing state election officials. It is all across the nation, from secretaries of state down to volunteer poll workers who have been accused of being part of a multiple 100,000 person conspiracy to steal an election, often for the candidate they voted against, and that nobody's talking. And there's no evidence of it. And I've talked to election officials who've told me that they've been accosted at their place of worship when they go to pray with their congregation and other places, and it breaks my heart because I know I don't do this work. I just support the people who do, like these people and so many in the audience who they do this work not because it pays well, not because it gives them fame and fortune or is a stepping stone. The people who do this work do it because it's a calling. I mean, it's, I thank you all for the work that you do. Thank those of you in the audience that contribute to this work. To anyone who's a volunteer poll worker, thank you for the work that you do. And thanks also, Bill, to you and to ASU for hosting this.
Yeah, David, thank you so much. And to the panel, I just want to thank Arizona State University for giving us the opportunity to create this Mechanics of Democracy lab here. Hopefully you all enjoyed this panel. These are 5 of the best people in the business here, and especially for the students who are here. Thank you for your interest. You know, please reach out to them. Look at their example. I think this is really what public service is all about, and that is one of our main missions here, to help develop that next generation of elections administrators, because we need them, and these are people that you can really look to as role models. So thank you to everyone for being here. Thanks to all of you. We know how busy you are. Thanks for coming to Phoenix, Arizona on a day when we broke a record. It was 99 today. So go home to your cooler states. Thank you so much for being here. And please stay tuned for more events in the future.